No one called the police when the first person disappeared. They called days later, when the mail wouldn't stop piling up, when the milk spoiled on the doorstep, when silence became impossible to ignore. Inside the apartment, everything was in place. The bed was made. The dishes were clean. There were no signs of fear and no signs of violence. Then the flowers arrived. White roses, fresh pine branches. No note, no sender. A second person vanished. Then a third, all elderly, all living alone. The city called it a pattern. The media called it murder. But the police dog didn't. The dog didn't smell panic, didn't smell a fight, didn't smell death. It only knew one thing. People had left. And somewhere in the middle of the investigation, the dog began reacting to something no one else thought mattered. Something ordinary. Something everyone walked past every day. And by the time anyone realized why, it was already too late. No one reported him missing. That was the first thing everyone agreed on later, when the case was already too large to ignore. No phone calls. No frantic relatives. No neighbors knocking on doors in panic. For days, maybe longer, the apartment remained exactly as it always had. Quiet, closed, invisible. It was only noticed because of the mail. Envelopes stacked neatly against the door, bending slightly at the corners. A grocery delivery box sat untouched beside them, the label already curling from the cold. A local newspaper lay folded on the welcome mat, dated nearly a week earlier. In a city that moved too fast to stop for anyone, this small stillness finally felt out of place. The building manager was the one who unlocked the door. Inside, nothing looked wrong. The apartment was clean in the way older homes often are. Not staged, not sterile, but carefully lived in. A mug sat washed and drying by the sink. The bed was made. A coat hung on the back of a chair, as if its owner planned to put it on again. There were no signs of struggle, no broken objects, no open drawers. Nothing suggested panic or force. It felt less like a crime scene and more like a pause. The man who lived there was 78 years old, widowed, no children nearby, no close friends anyone could name. He had paid his rent on time for years and spoken politely to neighbors in passing, the way people do when they do not expect to be remembered. The police marked the case as a welfare check at first, then a missing person, then, quietly, something else. A K9 unit was brought in more out of procedure than urgency. The dog moved through the apartment slowly, nose close to the floor, tail steady. It circled the living room once, paused near the bedroom door, then stopped at the threshold. It did not bark. It did not growl. It simply stood there longer than expected, as if waiting for something that did not arrive. The handler took note of it, though at the time it meant little. Dogs noticed many things humans dismissed. There was no scent of fear, no sharp spike of adrenaline, no trace of violence. Whatever had happened, if anything had happened at all, had not left behind the chemical chaos that usually followed a crime. The report reflected that uncertainty. Days passed. Then the flowers appeared. A bouquet of white roses stood upright against the apartment door, wrapped carefully in plain brown paper. Fresh pine branches were woven between the stems, their scent sharp and unmistakable, out of place in the narrow hallway. There was no card, no name, no explanation. The building manager assumed it was a mistake at first, but no one came to claim it. No florist called, no neighbor asked about it. No one said it aloud, but everyone thought the same thing. He must be dead. The flowers changed the tone of the conversation. What had been concern turned into acceptance. People stopped asking where he was and started asking how long he had been gone. The police file remained open, but it began to gather dust the way unresolved cases often do. Slowly, without ceremony, the K9 returned once more. This time, the dog went straight to the bouquet. It ignored the roses and pressed its nose into the pine branches, breathing deeply. The handler noticed the shift immediately. The dog's posture tightened, not with aggression, but with recognition. This scent meant something. Not danger, not death. Something else. Still, there was nothing actionable. Pine was common. Christmas was approaching. The city was full of trees and wreaths and decorations pulled from storage. The case remained unsolved until it happened again. Another apartment. Another elderly resident living alone. Another stretch of silence broken only by accumulating mail and untouched deliveries. Inside, the same careful neatness. The same absence of disruption, no forced entry, no obvious clues. And then, days later, another bouquet. White roses, fresh pine. No note. By the third case, the police could no longer pretend it was coincidence. The victims shared little beyond their age and their isolation. Different neighborhoods, different routines, no known connection. Yet the pattern repeated with unsettling precision. Clean apartments, no witnesses, no reports until it was already too late, and always the flowers. The K9 unit was called again, this time with more attention. At the second and third locations, the dog behaved the same way. Calm, focused, drawn not to closets or windows or doors, but to the space people had occupied, the armchair by the window, the side of the bed, the kitchen table where one place setting had been used for years. There was movement in these spaces. That much was clear. But there was no trace of resistance, no fear. By the end of the week, the media picked up the story. Headlines spoke of a possible serial abductor, a predator targeting the forgotten. The tone sharpened, and with it came speculation. Were these mercy killings? Organized crimes? Someone playing God? The flowers became evidence. Analysts debated their meaning. White roses for death, pine for concealment, Christmas as ritual, a signature perhaps, a message meant to be seen but not understood. The dog did not react to the headlines. But when the fourth bouquet appeared, this time placed carefully beside the building's Christmas decorations, the dog stopped walking altogether. It sat, not in alarm, not in confusion, in stillness. The handler followed its gaze down the hallway toward a space that held nothing visible at all. That night, another elderly resident did not come home. By morning, the mail had already begun to pile up. And somewhere in the city, someone was preparing another bouquet, certain that no one would come looking until it was too late. By the time the fifth person disappeared, the city had stopped pretending it was coincidence. The pattern was no longer subtle. It no longer hid behind bureaucratic language or cautious phrasing. 5 elderly residents. 5 apartments left behind in the same quiet condition. 5 stretches of time where no one noticed a human life had gone missing until the signs became impossible to ignore. Mail, milk, newspapers, silence. Each victim lived alone. No roommates, no regular visitors, no neighbors who could say with certainty when they were last seen. They occupied that fragile space between independence and invisibility, where days could pass without anyone expecting proof of life. And after each disappearance, the flowers came. White roses, always fresh. Pine branches, always real. Never artificial, never decorative. The bouquets appeared with the same patience as the disappearances themselves, placed gently, deliberately, as if someone wanted them to be found. But only after enough time had passed. There were still no notes, no fingerprints worth keeping, no witnesses. The police files grew thicker, but not clearer. Inside some of the apartments, investigators began to notice details they had missed before. Christmas cards addressed, but never mailed, resting neatly on kitchen counters. Radios tuned to holiday stations stopped mid-song. Boxes of ornaments pulled from closets, half open, their contents untouched. In one living room, a small artificial tree leaned against the wall, still wrapped in plastic. In another, a string of lights lay coiled on the sofa, as if someone had planned to decorate later. Later never came. These were not signs of celebration. They were signs of intention interrupted. The media moved faster than the investigation. Local news stations ran looping footage of police tape in apartment hallways. The word missing disappeared from headlines, replaced by darker language. Abductions, victims, serial crime. Commentators speculated freely, drawing connections where evidence remained thin. Someone suggested the flowers were a ritual. Someone else called them a signature. White roses for death, pine for concealment, Christmas as a countdown. The city listened. Fear, once distant, began to creep closer to home. The K-9 unit was brought in again, this time as a central part of the investigation rather than a formality. The dog moved through each apartment with the same controlled focus. It tracked the living spaces first, the places where a person spent the most time. Chairs worn smooth by years of use, beds made with habitual precision, tables set for one. It detected movement. That much was undeniable. Human presence had passed through these spaces recently. But the chemical markers investigators relied on were missing. There was no trace of panic, no spike of stress hormones embedded in carpets or fabric, no evidence of a struggle, even a brief one. Whatever happened in these apartments did not involve force. That contradiction haunted the investigation. Abductions usually left scars. Even careful criminals made mistakes. People resisted. Bodies reacted. Fear left a scent that lingered long after the event. Here, there was only absence. The dog reacted most strongly to the pine. At every scene, it returned to the branches woven into the bouquets. It did not chew them or paw at them. It inhaled slowly, deliberately, then stepped back, alert but calm. The handler noted it each time, though there was still no clear conclusion to draw. Pine was seasonal. Christmas trees were everywhere now. And yet, the scent followed the victims, not the season. By the sixth disappearance, the case had crossed an invisible line. Task forces were formed. Timelines overlapped. Analysts mapped the locations on city grids, searching for patterns that could explain what logic could not. The victims lived miles apart. Different districts, different economic backgrounds. No shared social circles. What they shared was simpler and harder to accept. They were alone. Public concern turned inward. Elderly residents received calls from distant relatives. Welfare checks increased. Churches organized volunteer visits. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the city remembered the people it had forgotten. Then the decorations went up. Inside the police department, the atmosphere shifted as December advanced. There was no grand display this year. Instead of the usual towering Christmas tree, A small felt tree made of dark green fabric was set up near the main lobby wall. It was simple, almost modest. Its flat surface pinned with a handful of red and gold ornaments, the kind meant to be removed and reused. No lights, no garlands, no scent of pine. Some said it felt more appropriate that way. The city was tense. Too many names had disappeared from too many apartment buildings. No one felt much like celebrating, and the department reflected that mood. The small tree was less a decoration than a gesture. Something to acknowledge the season without pretending things were normal. No one questioned it. It blended easily into the background, passed without notice by officers heading to briefings, detectives carrying paper cups of coffee, visitors lost in their own thoughts. It was quiet, unassuming, almost apologetic. The K-9 noticed it immediately. On the day the felt tree was put up, the dog slowed as it entered the lobby. It stopped several feet away and sat down, eyes fixed not on the ornaments themselves, but on the fabric beneath them. There was no scent to explain the reaction. No pine, no resin, nothing that should have held its attention. This was not curiosity. It was focus. The handler gently urged the dog forward, assuming distraction. But each time they passed the tree again, the response was the same. The dog did not bark. It did not alert. It simply refused to treat the tree as decoration, as if it were something else entirely. The briefing room was already tense when the barking started. It cut through the low hum of voices like a blade, sharp, sudden, impossible to ignore. Atlas, the K-9 assigned to the task force, stood rigid near the entrance to the lobby, his body locked in a forward stance. His barking was not frantic. It was forceful, repeated, directed, straight at the felt Christmas tree. At first, no one took it seriously. "Easy," someone muttered, more annoyed than concerned. Another officer joked that the dog didn't approve of fake decorations. In a city drowning in disappearances, a small green felt tree pinned to a wall felt like the least of their problems. Officer Daniel Harper didn't laugh. He tightened his grip on the leash as Atlas strained forward, muscles coiling beneath his fur. The dog's hackles were raised now, his focus absolute. This wasn't agitation. This wasn't distraction. This was urgency. "Let's get him out of here," someone suggested. "He's disrupting the room." Harper hesitated for half a second too long. Atlas lunged. The leash burned through Harper's palm as the dog surged forward with a strength that caught everyone off guard. Chairs scraped backward. Voices rose. Someone shouted his name. But Atlas was already there. He slammed into the felt tree. The pins tore free from the wall with a sharp, hollow sound. The fabric ripped loose and collapsed onto the floor in a wide green sheet. Ornaments scattered, bouncing and rolling across the tile. Red, yellow, plastic clattering into silence. Then everything stopped. The barking ceased. Atlas stood over the fallen fabric, chest heaving, eyes fixed downward. Harper reached him a second later, breath unsteady, heart racing, not from fear, but from something colder. Recognition. The felt tree lay fully unfurled across the floor now, no longer a decoration, but a shape. Lines ran beneath the fabric, thin, faint, deliberate. LED strands taped flat, branching and intersecting in a pattern that was suddenly impossible to unsee. Harper crouched slowly. He didn't touch it at first. He didn't need to. The shape was familiar. Too familiar. "It's a map," he said quietly. No one answered him. They were already seeing it too. Someone fetched a city grid. Another officer dropped to one knee, aligning corners, adjusting angles. The match was exact. Street by street, block by block. The red ornaments marked places already burned into the task force's memory, the apartments where the elderly had vanished. The yellow ones traced a future no one had wanted to imagine. Atlas sat down beside the map, calm now, silent, as if his work was done. Harper looked at the dog, then back at the city laid out on the floor of the police department lobby. What had once seemed harmless, quiet, seasonal, forgettable, had been hiding in plain sight. The tree had never been decoration. It had been a warning. The red ornaments matched locations already known to the investigation: apartment buildings, streets, corners where elderly residents had vanished without a trace. Each point aligned with unsettling precision. The yellow ornaments were fewer. They marked places the task force recognized only in theory. Areas that fit the pattern, but had not yet produced a disappearance. Neighborhoods with similar demographics. Buildings with similar layouts. Lives that matched the quiet criteria of the victims already gone. This was not symbolism. It was planning. The realization spread quickly and quietly. There were no raised voices, no dramatic declarations, just the slow, collective understanding that someone had been inside the investigation long enough to place this object where it would not be questioned, and careful enough to disguise intent as something harmless. Suspicion turned inward. Every person who had handled the decorations was reviewed. Volunteers, maintenance staff, officers assigned to logistics. The vendor who delivered the felt tree was contacted, interviewed, cleared. Security footage was examined frame by frame. Nothing stood out. No one lingered near the tree longer than expected. No one behaved strangely. No one noticed anything at all, which was, in itself, unsettling. The tree had not been hidden. It had been trusted. The department tightened quietly. Access logs were restricted. Information was compartmentalized. Conversations moved to closed rooms. The possibility of an insider, someone close enough to know the patterns, the locations, the rhythm of the investigation, hung over every briefing without ever being spoken aloud. And still, the disappearances continued. 2 nights later, before any action could be taken on the yellow markers, one of them turned red. An elderly woman living alone in a narrow townhouse near the river failed to answer her phone. Her mail began to collect. A grocery delivery sat untouched on her steps. By the time officers arrived, the house was already quiet. Inside, the same careful order, the same absence of chaos. A calendar hung in the kitchen, December dates neatly crossed off. A small radio on the counter played softly, the volume low enough to be missed if you weren't listening. The K9 moved through the space without urgency. No fear, no violence, only movement, deliberate and calm. Outside, the bouquet appeared before anyone thought to look for it. White roses, fresh pine. The red ornament on the map had predicted the timing within hours. At that point, the investigation shifted. This was no longer about where the victims had gone. It was about who had the patience to wait until no one noticed they were missing, and the discipline to repeat it without deviation. Analysts focused on the yellow points: traffic cameras, transit records, rideshare data, delivery routes. Anyone who appeared repeatedly near more than one marked location was flagged and reviewed. Most leads collapsed under scrutiny. One did not. Footage from a commercial camera near one of the yellow-marked buildings showed a man standing across the street late at night. He was not pacing. not looking around nervously. He appeared to be waiting. He returned on different nights, sometimes only for a few minutes, sometimes longer. He never approached the building, never spoke to anyone. He blended into the background with unsettling ease. On the night the woman disappeared, he was there again. This time, he left shortly before midnight. He did not carry flowers. He did not carry anything at all. The image was grainy, the angle imperfect. But it was enough. For the first time since the investigation began, there was a face that did not belong to a victim. The K9 was brought into the room where the footage played on a loop. The dog watched the screen briefly, then turned away, attention drifting back toward the hallway that led to the lobby, toward where the felt tree had stood, as if reminding them that the map had been there all along. By the end of the night, a name was attached to the image. Not yet a suspect, not officially, but close enough to change the direction of everything that followed. Outside, Christmas lights flickered on storefronts and apartment balconies across the city. Decorations went up. Music played. Life continued, indifferent to the lines being drawn beneath it. Somewhere, another yellow marker waited, and for the first time, the people trying to stop it were finally looking in the right direction. They arrested him before anything else could happen. That alone felt like a small victory. He was taken into custody near one of the yellow-marked locations, just hours after surveillance cameras confirmed his presence there for the third time that week. He did not run. He did not resist. When officers approached, he simply stood still, hands visible, expression vacant, as if the decision had already been made for him. There were no weapons on him, no flowers, no personal belongings beyond a worn jacket and a wallet with little inside. He went with them quietly, without asking where he was being taken. Inside the interrogation room, the tension softened into something stranger. He did not deny anything. From the beginning, his posture suggested surrender rather than defeat. Shoulders slumped, eyes unfocused. When asked about the missing elderly residents, he nodded slowly once, as if acknowledging an obvious truth. He told them he had taken them somewhere they wouldn't be found. He said it without hesitation, without drama. He explained that he had taken each of them to the coast, far enough from the city to avoid attention, that he had weighted their bodies and pushed them into the water, that the ocean was wide, patient, and efficient. He said it ensured no one would ever find them. No graves, no funerals, no answers. The statement fit the evidence too well. Clean apartments, no signs of struggle, no witnesses, no remains. Even the flowers made sense now. White roses for death, pine for concealment. A ritual, a farewell. Search teams were deployed along the shoreline. Boats moved slowly across cold gray water. Divers descended into depths where light barely reached. Days passed, then more days. Nothing surfaced, no bodies, no fragments, no proof that contradicted his confession. The media reacted first. Headlines shifted in tone, satisfied at last. A suspect in custody, a confession on record, a motive speculated, but no longer questioned. The story was packaged neatly. A methodical offender who targeted the elderly and ensured they would never be found. Inside the department, the case was quietly downgraded from active to closed. Paperwork moved forward. Charges were drafted. Psych evaluations scheduled. The machine of justice resumed its steady rhythm, relieved to have something it could process. Only one thing refused to settle. Atlas. The K9 began behaving differently once the suspect was in custody. He no longer reacted to the felt tree, now stored away as evidence. He no longer lingered near the map recreated from its layout. Instead, he returned again and again to the same place, the evidence room. Each time he passed the heavy metal door, he slowed. His head turned, his pace faltered. Sometimes he stopped altogether, sitting down in the hallway with quiet insistence, not alerting, not barking, waiting. Officer Daniel Harper noticed the pattern after the third time. At first, he dismissed it as residual stress. Dogs remembered scents long after cases ended. But Atlas wasn't tracking anything. He wasn't following a trail. He was asking. Harper requested access to the evidence room under the pretense of a routine check. Inside, shelves held labeled boxes. Clothing, ornaments, bags of soil samples. The felt tree folded carefully into evidence wrapping. Atlas walked past all of it. He stopped at a small cardboard box on the lowest shelf. Inside was an object few had paid attention to when it was collected from the suspect's apartment. A simple, old-fashioned music box. Wooden, scuffed at the edges, its surface carved with fading snowflakes. Harper lifted it carefully. The box had not been listed as relevant. No prints, no connection to the victims. Just a personal item, taken because it had been there. Atlas's tail stilled as Harper carried it out. The decision to bring the box into the interrogation room was not written into any protocol. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't interrogation technique. It was instinct. The suspect sat alone at the table, hands folded, eyes fixed on the blank wall. Days had passed since his confession. He looked smaller now, as if the certainty he had carried was beginning to erode. Harper placed the box on the table. He did not speak. He turned the key. The music began softly. A slow, imperfect version of a Christmas melody. Familiar, but worn. The notes wavered, the mechanism catching slightly between phrases. It was the kind of tune that lived in memory more than sound. The suspect froze. For a moment, nothing happened. Then his breathing changed, shallow, uneven. His hands tightened, fingers pressing hard into each other as if to anchor himself. The music played on. This song had never appeared in his statement. It wasn't in the case files. No one had asked him about it. No one had known to. His face collapsed inward, the composure draining away in seconds. His shoulders shook. Tears came suddenly, violently, the kind that arrived after long restraint. He cried without sound at first. Then the words broke free. He said he had taken them somewhere else, a place away from the city, away from the quiet apartments and unanswered doors, a place where winter meant gardens covered in frost, not silence, where Christmas meant voices in the same room. He did not call it a shelter. He did not call it a home. He called it the end, the place where they would not have to disappear alone. When he finally spoke clearly again, his voice was hoarse, stripped of pretense. I took them to their last place. The music box slowed, the melody winding down into silence. No one in the room moved. Outside, the department continued its routines. Phones rang, papers were filed. Decorations blinked softly in offices where people worked late. The case, on paper, was finished. But somewhere beyond the city's edges, something remained untouched, waiting. They expected the smell of salt. That was the unspoken assumption as the convoy moved beyond the edge of the city, past the last clusters of streetlights and into a stretch of road that narrowed into silence. Based on the confession, the search should have led them toward water, toward cliffs docks, or some forgotten shoreline where the ocean could erase what humans wanted to forget. Instead, the road curved inland. Houses grew farther apart. Traffic thinned. The city's noise dissolved into something softer, older. The sky hung low and pale, the late afternoon light dull with winter. Atlas shifted in the back of the vehicle. Not restless, not alert, calm. The coordinates they followed were pieced together from fragments, half-finished sentences, emotional pauses, the subtle cues only someone trained to listen could hear. The suspect had never said where in any precise sense. He had only described the place as final, quiet, away, the kind of word people used when they were tired of explaining. They parked at the end of a gravel road. No fences, no warning signs, no gates. Just a cluster of low buildings arranged loosely around an open yard. Smoke drifted upward from a chimney, thin and steady. Somewhere nearby, something clucked, a soft, familiar sound. No one drew a weapon. They moved carefully anyway. This was supposed to be a grave. The first thing they saw was green. Not the dull green of winter weeds, but organized rows, leafy vegetables growing under simple coverings, soil turned and tended. A small chicken coop stood near the edge of the yard, its door ajar. The sound they'd heard earlier came again, closer now. Laughter followed it. Human voices, old voices, uneven, warm, unmistakably alive. Atlas stepped out of the vehicle before anyone stopped him. His paws hit the ground, and he moved forward without hesitation, tail loose, posture relaxed. He crossed the yard like he belonged there. No alert, no warning. A woman noticed him first. White hair, pulled back loosely, hands still dusted with soil. She straightened, smiled, and crouched slightly as Atlas approached. He slowed, allowed her to touch his head. Everything about the scene was wrong, and because of that, everything suddenly made sense. The officers entered the yard as if stepping into a private moment. A man sat on a bench nearby, shelling peas into a bowl balanced on his knees. Another stood closer to the house, stirring something on a small outdoor stove. A string of simple lights hung between two posts, unlit in the daylight. There were no locks on the doors, no bars on the windows, no fear. Inside one of the buildings, the air was warm, clean. A pot simmered quietly on the stove. Photos lined the walls, not old family portraits, but recent ones. People sitting together, smiling, holding mugs, standing side by side in the snow. The victims moved freely through the space. They spoke calmly when asked questions. Not defensive, not confused. They knew exactly who the police were and why they had come. They also knew what the city believed, that they were dead. Some had assumed it. Others had been told directly. All of them had agreed. Not because they were coerced, but because the alternative felt worse. They described their old lives without bitterness. Apartments where days passed without conversation, holidays marked by silence, weeks where the only voices they heard came from television screens. Then a man had knocked. Not forced entry, not persuasion, just a presence, a question. Would you like to go somewhere else? They had been told they could say no. None of them had. The place they were brought to was simple by design. No name, no official status. Just a shared understanding. They worked the land together, cooked together, ate together, celebrated small things, Christmas included, especially Christmas. The suspect's story, once pieced together fully, did not begin with crime. It began with absence. His mother had died on Christmas Eve, years earlier. Alone in her apartment while he was away on a work trip he couldn't leave. She had been found days later, the same way the first victim had been discovered in this case, by mail piling up, by silence finally becoming visible. That image had stayed with him, the way a person could vanish without anyone noticing until the world itself began to leave evidence behind. What followed was not rage, but conviction. He believed loneliness was the real ending, that death was only the final punctuation mark. And if the city was willing to accept that some people simply disappeared, then he would let it believe they were gone, completely. He built the illusion carefully. Clean exits, no resistance. Flowers placed only after enough time had passed for assumptions to harden. A map hidden in plain sight, not as a taunt, but as a record. Not of deaths, of departures. Back at the site, one of the investigators stood quietly near the garden, watching two elderly men argue cheerfully over the placement of a fence post. Chickens scattered at their feet. "This isn't a crime scene," he said finally, more to himself than anyone else. Then, after a pause, "He didn't abduct them." No one corrected him. He was just the only one who knocked. The legal system would not allow the story to end there. The suspect was charged, sentenced, required to undergo long-term psychological treatment. The law could not ignore what had been done, no matter how carefully intention had tried to disguise itself as mercy. But neither could it ignore what had been revealed. Every person in that yard submitted a written statement. Each one asked for leniency. Each one described a choice they had made willingly, eyes open, without regret. Public opinion fractured. Some called him dangerous, others called him necessary. Most didn't know what to call him at all. The city responded in quieter ways. Funding shifted. Outreach programs expanded. New systems were put in place to check on those who lived alone, not after they vanished, but before. It was not redemption. It was adjustment. The case was closed officially weeks later. Files archived, evidence cataloged. The felt tree returned to storage, stripped now of meaning it could never carry again. Atlas returned to duty. Sometimes, when passing through the city, he would pause near apartment doors where no mail gathered anymore, where voices answered. No one wrote about that. They wrote about the ending instead. No one had been murdered. But people had been disappearing long before this story began. And that was the part no one knew how to sentence. No one was killed. But there were lives the city had already stopped looking for, long before they vanished.